Tonight we continue our study in the fruit of the Spirit. Part 2, of course, the first week was love. Last week that Ryan introduced the fruits of the Spirit. Tonight we'll talk about joy. So we'll be looking at Galatians 5:22 and also some other passages. But if you want to turn to Galatians 5:22, that's where the fruit of the Spirit are listed, and you see the second one there being joy. When I was in seminary, one of my professors, my preaching professor, in fact, he said, there are 3 words you should never start a sermon with. He said, that's Webster's Dictionary defines. He said, anytime I've heard a sermon that starts with Webster's Dictionary defines, it might be some word like maybe tonight, Webster's Dictionary defines joy as, he said, I always know that's going to be a boring sermon whenever I hear that. So he said, don't ever do it, because that always just shows us it's going to be boring. So even though this is a Bible study, not a sermon, and even though it's not a regular Bible study, it's a word study, it makes it tempting to start that way because we're talking about joy, so what is joy? But I won't do that to you because I don't want you to, especially now that I've told you that means it's going to be boring. I don't want it to be boring. So we're not going to start with a Webster's Dictionary definition. But since we're spending the next 30 minutes or so talking about one word, we do have to figure out what it means. So I want to start by thinking about what joy is not. And I want it to be interactive tonight, so if you have some thoughts, if you'd like to answer a question, they're not all rhetorical questions. I really do want people to answer tonight. So the first thing I want us to think about is what word would you consider to be the opposite of joy?
Sadness.
Okay.
Frustration.
Frustration, okay.
Stress.
Stress, yeah.
Anger.
Lindsay said depression on the call if you couldn't hear her.
Anger.
Anger, mm-hmm. Well, I'll go ahead and, Don, if you wouldn't mind passing out our handouts. There's no right answer, and that's partly why I didn't want you to have the handout yet. But I want to look at a couple of verses that pair joy with some words that are opposite to it. And I think that'll help us to get a greater understanding of what joy is. So once everybody's got a handout, I'd love 3 volunteers. We've got 3 passages, so I'd love to have 3 volunteers to read those passages. Actually, now that I think about it, for the sake of those on the call, I should probably do it myself, so they can hear too. The first passage is John chapter 16, verses 20 through 22. So once everybody's got a handout, I'll read that to you. Thanks. So here's what it says. Truly, truly, I say to you that you will weep and lament, but the world will rejoice. You will grieve, but your grief will be turned into joy. Whenever a woman is in labor, she has pain because her hour has come. But when she gives birth to the child, she no longer remembers the anguish because of the joy that a child has been born into the world. Therefore, you too have grief now, but I will see you again, and your heart will rejoice, and no one will take your joy away from you. Then in 2 Corinthians 2:3, Paul says this. He says, this is the very thing I wrote you, so that when I came, I would not have sorrow from those who ought to make me rejoice, having confidence in you all that my joy would be the joy of you all. And then in Hebrews chapter 12, it says, all discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful, but sorrowful. Yet those who have been trained by it, afterwards it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. So some words that we see contrasted to joy are, some of you mentioned some of these. Suffering, sorrow, and pain. And some of those we kind of expected, right? We mentioned sorrow, sadness, and things like that. But I thought it was interesting to see suffering and pain. That's not something I would have thought of, and it's not something anybody mentioned. How do you guys think that joy is the opposite of suffering? How do you see that, or do you see that as an opposite to joy?
What's the word you said?
Suffering or pain.
Maybe because of the event that you're suffering for just smothers you, overwhelms you, where you, for a time you can't see anything.
Right. So if you're suffering badly enough, you may not be able to see where you can find joy. Right.
Even when suffering, there's that inner peace
Mm-hmm.
that you have. If you know the Lord, you have that inner peace to know that it's all going to work out for His good, no matter what.
Right, yeah, so we experience an inner peace even when we suffer, and
Yeah.
we're going to talk about that a little more in a minute here, but that's a great observation. You know, even in one of the hymns that we sing, it says, I need thee every hour in joy or pain. So it even made its way into our hymnody, and I don't think the hymn writer picked pain just because it rhymes with vain. I think it probably comes from these scripture passages. So we see that in the biblical text, we see it even in the music that we sing on Sundays together. But there is a way that joy can be the opposite of suffering, like several of you mentioned. But I think they can also coexist. So if we look at this next passage, it says, I heard and my inward parts trembled. At the sound my lips quivered. This is from Nehemiah, by the way. Or sorry, Habakkuk. The reference is on the back. Decay enters my bones, and in my place I tremble, because I wait quietly for the day of distress, for the people to arise who will invade us. Though the fig tree should not blossom, and there be no fruit on the vines, though the yield of the olive should fail, and the fields produce no food, though the flock should be cut off from the fold, and there be no cattle in the stalls, yet I will exult in the Lord, and I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. The Lord is my strength, and he has made my feet like hinds' feet, and makes me walk on my high places. That's Habakkuk 3, 16 through 19. So this is an instance where the book of Habakkuk is writing about, all these, the whole chapter 3, if you read the whole chapter, all these bad things are happening. They're getting attacked, it feels like the kingdom's falling apart, all these bad things are happening. And he names some of them, starting in verse 16 that I mentioned there. The day of distress, people who are invading, everything just seems gloomy and seems like despair. But yet he says, I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. So like Judy said a minute ago, even when he's going through all these bad things that he lists off, and again, it's not just 4 verses, it's a whole chapter of bad things that are happening, bad things that are coming. We could read that whole chapter and see more of it, but you kind of get the idea from this passage here. But yet, he still finds the ability to rejoice. And then in Philippians chapter 4, verse 4, it says, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. I think that word always is so important. We're told to rejoice always, not just rejoice when things are good. Again, I say rejoice. Rejoice when there's reason to be happy, but rejoice in the Lord always. And then in Matthew chapter 5, in the Sermon on the Mount, this is what Jesus said. He said, blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So he says, when you're persecuted, when people are insulting you, rejoice and be glad. And the craziest part is that's what they did, right? It wasn't just an empty command that got ignored. If you look in Acts chapter 5, if you look in 1 Peter chapter 1, we see examples of that. In fact, if somebody has your Bible, would you read Acts 5:40 and 41 for us? Acts chapter 5, verses 40 and 41.
And they took his advice, and after calling the apostles in, they flogged them and ordered them to speak no more in the name of Jesus, and then released them. So they went on their way from the presence of the council, rejoicing that they had been considered worthy to suffer shame for his name.
Oh. So they're getting flogged, and it says they rejoiced that they were considered worthy to suffer. Wow, that's pretty remarkable, isn't it? Would somebody read 1 Peter 1, 6 through 9 for us?
In this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may be proved genuine and may result in praise glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. Though you have not seen him, you love him. Even though you do not see him now, you believe in him and are filled with an inexpressible and glorious joy. For you are receiving the goal of your faith, the salvation of your souls.
So you're filled with an inexpressible and glorious joy while you're suffering. So they lived out what Jesus said to do in the Sermon on the Mount. Throughout the New Testament, I could pull in other examples, but I think you get the picture, right? That different times that people are persecuted, or they're mistreated, or they're insulted, or all these bad things are happening to them, they still manage to rejoice. So the question I want us to ask, and kind of really want us to spend some time thinking about this, and is this. So we see that joy is not dependent on our circumstances, right? We can be joyful when things are good. We can be joyful when things are bad. We're encouraged to always be joyful, like it says in Philippians there. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. And we know that joy is one of the fruits of the Spirit. So Paul tells us that these fruits of the Spirit are the ways that we demonstrate that we have the Spirit in our lives, right? That's what the fruit means, is that this is the demonstration that I have the Spirit in my life, is I have love, and I have joy, and I have peace, and all the other ones. So if we know all those things to be true, then why is joy so often absent from the lives of Christian people? I could probably give you guys 100 examples of different Christians who don't really seem joyful. And I'm not going to call anybody out, but I'm sure you know of people too. And maybe even that's something you've experienced in your own life. So if we know all those things to be true, we're always supposed to be joyful. Joy is not dependent on our circumstances. Joy is one of the fruit of the Spirit. We're told to always be joyful. Why don't we see it more? Why don't we see more joyful Christians?
I think it's a lack of faith.
Okay. That could be a lack of faith. Why else?
A weak faith.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We tend to look at the negative so much instead of the good things.
Right. It's easy to focus on the negative, especially if you pick up a newspaper, turn on the TV, right? Yeah. What else?
Now think of it, when Junior was in college, he was talking about that this professor brought in this big piece of white cardboard, and he had one little black dot in the middle, and he held it up to the class and said, "What do you see?" Everybody saw the black dot.
Mm-hmm.
Not on the whiteboard, but the black dot.
Yeah.
And that's like Francis said, that's what we have a tendency to concentrate on the black dot.
Yeah. Yeah. It's easy to see the negative or the imperfection or whatever it is. Well, I thought of a few different reasons why I think that this might happen. And they're all different, so they're not even necessarily all bad things, but just some different reasons why it can happen. The first one is that we allow circumstances or emotions to dictate our response to the world. So this is kind of similar to like what you guys said. So when we see things going badly all around us, you know, like in Habakkuk chapter 3, right? We turn on the news, oh, things are going badly. We talked about the building in Florida that's crumbling, and you know, COVID is still out in our world, and they're even saying that maybe we need to all wear masks again because it's starting to pick up. And we think about all the different things that are just bad news after bad news, right? It's easy to let those circumstances dictate, or just to let my reaction to things that have happened, my emotions dictate response to the world, right? And you know, I think that leads to the second one, which is a confusion about what joy really is. So joy is not a feeling and it's not an emotion, right? We said that joy is not dependent on our circumstances. Our feelings are, right? So I find $20 on the ground, I'm happy, feeling good, right? I bang my elbow into the wall and it's hurting, I'm not happy, I'm not feeling good, I'm feeling sad, right? You know, something really good happens, maybe it's payday or you get a promotion at work, something like that, oh, I'm really happy, you know? But, you know, have a flat tire, well, now I'm not happy anymore, I'm sad. But that's not how joy works, right? Joy doesn't fluctuate like happiness, and it's easy, I think, to just lump joy into one of those emotions as like super happy, big happy, right? Extra happy. But it's not really the same thing. It's not one of those temporal emotions that just flares up and depends on circumstances. So like Judy said earlier, we still have an inner peace that we know is there even when we're struggling. I think sometimes a third one I'll mention is very different. For a lot of people, mental illness can play a part. People have depression or anxiety that can mask joy. And one thing to remember is that that's not a failure and it's not a weakness. It's an illness. Just like if I get sick, Jonathan, what, are you stupid? Why'd you get sick? You might remember a little while back I even did a sermon on a Sunday about that. So I won't repeat myself of what I said back then, but so many times people think of those things as a failure or a weakness, but it's just an illness. It's no different than when I broke my arm. Now, of course, that was a little bit of clumsiness playing into things. But when you get sick or something like that happens, nobody blames you. Nobody thinks that you're a failure, and you don't think that about yourself. So sometimes those things can come. It's a physical condition, it's a mental condition, it's a chemical imbalance. Those kinds of things can mask reality a little bit. But that kind of thing aside, I think the biggest thing that happens to a lot of people is just letting those circumstances or emotions dictate our response to the world. I think there are a lot of Christians who are driven by fear right now for different reasons. Church attendance across the world is declining in most places. There are some places, especially in Asia, where it's actually exploding. And it's really exciting. Africa and Asia, places like that, Christianity's on the rise. But places where Christianity has been for a long time, Europe, North America, Christianity is suffering. And so it's easy to be fearful. We think about our own church. We had a lot more people here 30 years ago than we do now. And it's easy to think, I'm concerned and fearful about our future, not just as Dalewood, but our future for the North American church, our future for the European church, because those are two very populous areas of the world where Christianity is struggling. So it's easy to let things like that drive fear. Like I said, you could pick up the newspaper and watch TV too, and see things that are going on in the world, and it can cause fear. But like I said a minute ago, we don't want to let those kinds of things take over, because when fear is the driving emotion for a Christian, it can really lead to a bad place. Unfortunately, there are conspiracy theories that are really gaining traction in Christianity. Even pastors preaching conspiracy theories from the pulpit. Different ones about different things, like you guys might have heard several years ago about conspiracy theory involving this pizza parlor in New York that supposedly had a child sex trafficking ring in it. And this guy took this conspiracy theory so seriously that he went up to the pizza parlor with an assault rifle, and he barged in and he said, "Where's the basement?" And they said, "What are you talking about? There's no basement." He said, "Well, that's where you keep the kids." And they said, "Sir, there's not a basement here." He goes, "What's behind that door?" And he kicks the door open, thinking that's the stairs down to the basement, and it's just their little IT closet where they've got a couple computers that run the register. And so he gets there, and there's no basement where they supposedly kept the kids. So this guy's now in jail for 4 years because he busted into this pizza parlor with a gun because he believed this conspiracy theory. Excuse me. Now, I don't know whether he's a Christian or not, but I do know that some of these conspiracy theories are really gaining ground in churches, and it's really alarming. And I think it's because so many people are getting caught up in fear, and they're so afraid of what can happen in the world around us, whether it's politics or it's world events or different things, that they feel so fearful that they feel like they have to look for something deeper, and then they get dragged into these conspiracy theories that are really designed to play on fearful people, because these conspiracy theories are intentionally designed to play on fear. And so if you're fearful, you're extra vulnerable, and so fear can drive us to bad places. But that's why we have to do like Judy said earlier, and always remember that inner peace that we have, and remember that our joy is still there even when things do seem grim, whether things are great or things are bad. And of course, all of us in this room might have a different opinion on whether things are great and things are bad, just based on what's going on in your personal life. But whether things feel great right now or things feel bad, we have to remember that inner peace, and we have to remember that joy that's there regardless of our circumstances. I want to close, and we're going to end a little early tonight, but I want to close with going back to that passage that I read when we started in John 16. When Jesus, this is printed on your handout here, when Jesus foretold his death and resurrection in John 16:22, he predicted that the people would grieve his passing, but when he would return to them, this is what he said: I will see you again, and your heart will rejoice, and no one can take your joy away from you. And that's a phrase I want us to all remember tonight. No one will take your joy away from you. So Jesus is foretelling his death, and they didn't quite get it. If you remember, there are several times in the Bible where Jesus says, kind of cloaks it a little bit, hey, I'm about to die, but it's okay, because 3 days later I'll rise from the dead. He didn't say it quite that vividly. He kind of alluded to it, and they didn't understand, and so he said it a little more clearly. They still didn't understand. And then he tried to make it a little more clear. But in that passage that we read earlier, he said, therefore you too have grief now, but I will see you again, and your heart will rejoice, and no one will take your joy away from you. Because Jesus lives, no one can take our joy away from us. So that's the thing I'd love for us to remember tonight. No matter what happens in the world around us, no matter if things seem great or they seem bad, because Jesus lives, no one can take our joy away from us, as it says there in John chapter 16. So, does anybody want to share any thoughts about that? Any of those passages or about joy? I'd love to hear what you guys have to say about it.
Jonathan, yesterday I was watching Talk of the Town, and they had this guest on there. It was I forget his name, but he'd written a book, and he was like an astro something or other. I can't remember. I don't remember a lot about what was said except a statement that he made, and I thought, man, you need to read your Bible, and you know. He said, we don't know how this began or how it's going to end. And I thought, yes, we do.
What was he talking about? Just about the universe?
He had written a book about the universe and trying to explain the planets and the stars and all of that. But I thought, I know how it began and I know how it's going to end too.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those on the call, Francis was saying that someone on TV said, wrote a book about the universe and said, we don't know how it began and we don't know how it will end. And of course, we do know that. And working with our youth group, most Wednesdays I don't get to be with you guys because I'm with the youth. And a few months ago, we did a night where they could just ask questions, just whatever they wanted to learn about, whatever they didn't know about. And a few of them had questions about science and things like that. And one thing I told them is that, so many people try to pit the Bible against science, but really they work together, because as much as you study science, there are questions that science can't answer that the Bible does. And there are questions that the Bible doesn't try to answer that science does. So they really fit together. So, if you believe every scientific theory out there, like Francis said, the conclusion you draw is, I don't really know how all this started and I don't know what's going to happen at the end. Well, we know the beginning and the end. We know that God created the universe, and we know what's going to happen in the end, and we can find comfort in that too. Knowing that Jesus is going to return, we can definitely find joy in those things. So thanks for sharing that, Francis.
I was thinking that song, When the Morning Comes. We'll see you again.
Yeah.
I was thinking, joy, 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 down in my heart.
I thought about that too.
Yeah.
The kids' song, I've got the joy, 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 joy.
Yeah.
I remember singing that as a kid, not quite understanding it.
But it was fun to sing.
No, yeah, you get to the piece that passes understanding, it's just a tongue twister at that point. I think that was what made that song so fun. People tried to say it really fast. Piece that passes understanding. Yeah, now Lindsay's singing it on the call there.
But we can't hear her.
Yeah, Lindsay started singing the song that Don was talking about on the call. All right, well, thanks everybody for being here tonight. We'll see you Sunday for worship.